Have you ever shared a home with someone for years, yet felt more alone than if you lived by yourself? Eleanor Hartley had been married to one of the most powerful men in Boston for 3 years, but not once had they shared a bed. No fights, no passion, no connection. Just two people living behind locked emotional doors in a house filled with silence and schedules. She gave up her career, her voice, even her identity, all for a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. But when another man entered her life, someone who truly saw her, Eleanor was faced with a question no one can answer lightly. Do you stay and try to rebuild a life with the one who once forgot how to love you, or do you walk away towards someone who never needed reminding? This isn't just a story about love, it's about choosing yourself, even when your heart is split between history and hope. So, if it were you, what would you choose? Join us on this emotional journey of silence, awakening, and second chances. If the story touches something deep in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories for more heart-opening tales like this one. Now, let's begin. The Royce estate stood quietly at the edge of a sleepy town in New Hampshire, its white columns and shuttered windows exuding old money and stoic elegance. Every morning, the mist drifted over the manicured lawn, like silk unraveling from the sky. The roses in the southern garden were always in bloom, no matter the season. It was the kind of house people drove past and said, they must have it all, but inside, it was eerily still. Eleanor Hartley Royce moved through the grand kitchen in soft slippers, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by polished hardwood floors and too many empty rooms. At 34, she wore her solitude like a second skin familiar, not entirely painful, but always present. Her hands moved methodically, preparing breakfast for a husband who never asked and never thanked her. The coffee brewed at exactly 5:45 a.m. 2 scrambled eggs, lightly salted, whole wheat toast, no butter, a glass of water with a single ice cube. She didn't need to ask his preferences, she had learned them from watching, from existing around him. And every morning, she left the plate untouched at the edge of the dining table. He would pass by at 6:15 sharp, nod once if he remembered, and disappear behind the sound of a closing door. Nathaniel Royce was the kind of man who could command a boardroom without raising his voice. 42 years old, impeccably dressed, always 10 steps ahead in business but at home. He was a ghost, wrapped in Armani. He lived like he was managing an empire made of glass, precise, unbending, and afraid to let anything fall. They had been married for 3 years, and not once had they shared a bed. Eleanor often found herself on the back porch around 7 a.m., nursing a cup of lukewarm tea and staring out at the dew-covered roses. It was the only place in the house that felt like hers. The garden didn't ask anything from her, it responded. A rose would bloom when she watered it. A weed would die when she pulled it. Simple, honest. Unlike everything else. She wasn't unhappy. Exactly. Just unremembered. There was no cruelty in Nathaniel's eyes. Just absence. His gaze would pass over her like sunlight through a stained glass window warming. Maybe, but never touching. Sometimes, she wondered if that was worse than hate. At least, hatred was a form of recognition. Once, Eleanor had been a brilliant economics professor at Boston University. Her lectures were passionate, full of vision. Students called her the mind with a heartbeat because she made numbers feel like stories. She had dreams, real ones. A nonprofit that educated young women about financial literacy. A book that told economic history through the lens of single mothers and forgotten workers. A life. But 3 years ago, it all changed. Her father's antique furniture business, a legacy built over 2 generations, collapsed overnight after a failed investment with a fraudulent partner. The debt was crushing. There were lawsuits, threats, even whispers of jail time. Eleanor had tried everything, but the walls kept closing in. Then came Nathaniel, cold, polished, in control. He offered her father a deal, full debt relief, a quiet settlement, and restoration of the family's reputation if Eleanor agreed to marry him. No children expected, no affection required, just public appearances and a name on legal documents. It was a business transaction. And Eleanor, smart, principled Eleanor said yes. She told herself it was temporary, a necessary trade, sacrifice for family. But deep down, some part of her still ached with the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could thaw the man who wore armor like skin. 3 years later, the hope had crusted over like frost on old glass. The grandfather clock chimed softly as she rinsed her teacup. The sun was higher now, bathing the kitchen in soft gold. Nathaniel had long gone. His car was never in the driveway past 6:20. Eleanor walked past the empty dining table, the untouched breakfast still warm, and paused at the staircase. She looked up, toward the second floor where his room sat across the hall from hers. The hallway between them might as well have been a continent. She placed a hand on the banister, tracing the smooth wood. "This isn't a life," she whispered to no one. "It's a well-decorated silence." She thought of the woman she used to be, the laughter that once came so easily, the way her mother used to say, "You walk into a room like you're carrying sunshine in your pockets." Now she moved like a shadow in her own story. Maybe it would always be this way. Maybe some stories weren't written with love in mind. Still, that morning perhaps because of the faint smell of fresh lavender, or the way a bird landed on the window box without fear, something shifted. A tightness in her chest, usually dormant, pressed a little harder. She didn't know it yet. But that day, everything would change. The Royce estate looked even grander in the evening light. Shadows from the old oak trees stretched long and solemn across the stone walkways, and the fountain out front hummed with a quiet, mechanical rhythm, like it was the only thing still breathing in a house built more for status than for living. Eleanor stood at the edge of the upstairs hallway, barefoot, her hand resting on the knob of her bedroom door. Across the hall, another door. His door remained shut, as always. 3 years. Not once had she opened it. Not for comfort, not for closeness. It wasn't forbidden. It simply wasn't expected. Their marriage was built like a contract, clear terms, signed lines, defined roles. And even within those lines, they barely touched. She remembered their wedding like a watercolor painting, soft edges, muted color, and too much white space. The ceremony had been private, classy, held in a church that looked like a museum. Her gown was elegant, modest, chosen more for its symbolism than for her taste. Nathaniel wore a charcoal gray suit and stood perfectly still beside her. Not once did his hand tremble when he slipped the ring onto her finger. "I promise to respect you," he said. He never promised to love her. Eleanor hadn't cried. Not then. Not even later when she stood alone in a hotel suite that had 2 bedrooms and a silent dinner already waiting under silver domes. She had told herself this was what adults did. They made sacrifices. They honored duty. They didn't expect fairy tales. But what she hadn't expected was the emotional famine that came with it. Nathaniel was a man of habit. He woke at 5:30 a.m. without an alarm, ran exactly 3. 1 miles on the treadmill, drank 1 cup of black coffee, never 2, left for the office by 6:20 a.m. sharp, returned by 7:10 p.m. unless traveling, had dinner prepared, served at 7:30 p.m. Sometimes he asked how her day was. Most times, he didn't. He never raised his voice. He never drank to excess. He never made a cruel remark. But he also never asked how she was sleeping, never remembered her favorite kind of wine, never reached for her hand when they passed each other in the hallway. It was a life with no bruises, but also no warmth, no fights, but no laughter, no drama, but no delight. At night, Eleanor lay in her queen-sized bed, surrounded by soft sheets and elegant silence. She would stare at the ceiling, sometimes listening to the distant hum of Nathaniel's voice on conference calls or the low baritone of him reading reports aloud in his office. Sometimes she whispered into the dark, "Do you even know who I am?" She never got an answer. She had once believed in love with a fierceness that made her students smile. During lectures, she'd quote poetry while explaining economic trends, comparing inflation to broken promises, or mergers to second marriages. Her students loved her for it. They said she made them feel things, even when they were only studying data. Now, she hadn't read a poem in years. There was a moment, about a year into the marriage, when Eleanor had tried to shift things. It had been spring. The cherry blossoms were in bloom. Nathaniel had invited a group of international investors for a dinner at the estate. She spent hours preparing selecting wine, coordinating a meal, even practicing casual conversation. She wore a sapphire blue dress that complemented her figure in a way that felt quiet but intentional. That evening, as she walked down the grand staircase, Nathaniel had glanced up. For a brief second, barely noticeable, his eyes softened. Then it vanished. "You look appropriate," he had said. She smiled politely. "Thank you." The evening passed in polite small talk and formal nods. Nathaniel introduced her only when necessary, and even then, with the kind of detachment you use when talking about antique furniture, rare, well kept, but not to be touched. That night, she cried in the bathtub with the faucet running, just to drown the sound of it. She had never tried again. Sometimes, Eleanor would wonder why Nathaniel even married her at all. Yes, she had saved her father's name. Yes, he needed a respectable wife for public appearances. But there were easier women. Ones who didn't read people so deeply. Ones who wouldn't look at him and see more than he wanted to reveal. He never talked about his past. Never mentioned family, loss, or anything that might explain the ice in his voice. But Eleanor saw the way he avoided old music, the way he stiffened at mentions of Vermont, or how his eyes darted when anyone asked about holidays. There were ghosts in him. And somewhere along the way, he had built walls so high, even he couldn't remember where the doors were. And she's stubborn, patient. Eleanor had been waiting at those locked doors with nothing but a rose in her hand and hope in her heart. But hope withers without sunlight. And Eleanor, once a woman who lit rooms with her voice, was slowly dimming. Yet something was shifting now. A crack, so faint it might have been imagined. The way his eyes lingered a bit too long at dinner last week. The silence in his voice when she spoke of Michael Alden, the man from her university days, recently in town. Something was there, not love yet, but perhaps awareness, a recognition, a beginning of an ache. And sometimes, Eleanor thought, the beginning of ache is the first sign a heart is still alive. It was just after 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon when the phone rang. Not a text, not a calendar reminder, a real call. The name flashing across Eleanor's screen made her pause, teacup frozen midair. Nathaniel. He never called, not in the middle of the day, not ever, really. Their conversations usually began and ended with dinner table courtesies or formal nods in passing. She let it ring twice more before answering. "Eleanor," came his voice, crisp and deliberate as ever. "Yes," she replied, neutral, but not unkind. "There's a charity event this evening, 7 o'clock. The Garrison Foundation is hosting a gala downtown. I need you to accompany me." She blinked. "You need me?" A pause, the kind of silence that felt rehearsed. "You're my wife. It's time you're seen as such." That was all he said. The line clicked dead before she could form another question. Eleanor stood motionless in the living room, the late sunlight catching on the dust motes in the air. For a moment, she thought maybe she had misheard him, but the text came seconds later. "Car will pick you up at 6:30 p.m. Formal attire." Eleanor stared at her closet like it belonged to a stranger. There were beautiful dresses, many still with price tags, all paid for by a man who never asked her what color made her feel alive. She reached for a deep crimson gown she'd once bought during a flash of old optimism, a color she hadn't dared wear around Nathaniel. It had a high neckline and soft, flowing sleeves, modest but confident. It made her feel real. As she stood before the mirror, adjusting the fabric over her shoulders, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she finally looked like someone who expected to be seen. At exactly 6:30 p.m., she descended the staircase. Nathaniel was already waiting at the bottom, dressed in a midnight black tuxedo, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression as unreadable as always. His eyes lifted the moment her heels clicked against the last step. For a fraction of a second, too brief to catch his gaze, shifted. Something flickered. Surprise. Maybe even admiration. "You look appropriate," he said. She bit back a smile. "And you look like money." He offered his arm, for the first time in years. Eleanor placed her hand on it. The contact was unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. His body was warm beneath the expensive fabric. She caught the faint scent of his cologne, woodsy, understated, familiar in a way that made her chest ache. They didn't speak during the ride downtown. The silence between them had become so practiced, it barely registered anymore. But Eleanor kept glancing sideways, wondering why. After 3 years of invisibility, he had suddenly summoned her into the light. The Garrison Foundation Gala was held at the historic Grand Whitmore Hotel. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars in the vaulted ballroom ceiling. Waiters moved like ghosts between glittering clusters of politicians, investors, and philanthropists. Nathaniel walked beside her with ease, his hand on the small of her back, another first. It was a practiced touch, but steady, possessive in the way of someone staking a claim they never had to announce before. He introduced her smoothly. "My wife, Eleanor Royce." The words were crisp, almost clinical, yet they hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. People turned. Some offered polite greetings. Others, especially women, blinked in surprise. One red-lipped guest leaned in, clearly amused. Well, I thought Mr. Royce was single." Eleanor smiled gently, but said nothing. She let her presence speak for her. She stood a little taller, leaned subtly toward Nathaniel just enough to play the part. She wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe pride, maybe hope, maybe some silent rebellion against her own invisibility. Nathaniel kept her close all evening, yet barely spoke. He guided her from group to group, letting the buzz of conversation carry them. But at one point, as they passed a waiter offering champagne, he hesitated. "I didn't mean for tonight to surprise you," he said, almost under his breath. Eleanor tilted her head. "Did you mean it to matter?" He didn't answer, but his hand, still resting lightly on her back, didn't move. Midway through the evening, Eleanor excused herself to step outside. The ballroom was stunning. Yes, but stifling in a way that had nothing to do with the crowd. She found the balcony empty, save for a tall man with silver at his temples and kind eyes that immediately lit up when he turned. "Eleanor Hartley," he said with a smile. "I'll be damned." She blinked. "Michael Alden." He laughed a warm, genuine sound. "It is you. I almost didn't recognize you. You look—" He stopped, eyes scanning her with appreciation, not hunger. Radiant. Something in her chest tightened. It had been years since someone said that and meant it without agenda. Michael had been a guest lecturer back when Eleanor taught at Boston University. They had shared a coffee, a handful of intellectual debates, and a mutual respect that had hovered on the edge of something more. "What brings you here?" she asked. "Just moved back to Boston, working with a nonprofit focused on economic revitalization. I'm actually looking for someone to help head up a new project in Colorado." "You ever think about going back to the world?" Eleanor's smile faltered for half a second. "I think about it every day." They talked until the air chilled their skin and a violin note from inside called them back. As they re-entered the ballroom, Nathaniel stood across the room, watching. He didn't move, but his jaw clenched just slightly. His eyes never left hers. And for the first time, Eleanor wondered, had she just been seen not as a wife, not as an accessory, but as a woman? Something had shifted. The silence had cracked, and behind that silence was the sound of something waking up. The following morning, the Royce estate was as still as ever, but something in Eleanor was no longer silent. She sat by the kitchen window with her tea, watching sunlight filter through the lace curtain. Her crimson dress from the night before now hung over a chair like a discarded memory too bold, too real for a house built on restraint. She thought of Michael Alden's words, still echoing gently in her mind. "You look radiant." 3 simple words, spoken with warmth, not possession, admiration, not expectation. And then Nathaniel's voice, cold and clipped. "You look appropriate." She exhaled slowly, fingertips tracing the rim of her teacup. There was no comparison. One saw her, the other assessed her. Later that afternoon, a courier arrived at the estate with a bouquet of white orchids and a handwritten card. "Thank you for last night." In R. It was the first note he had ever written her. She turned the card over, blank, not a single sentence more. No warmth, no inquiry, no invitation, just acknowledgement. Eleanor placed the card in the drawer beside her favorite novels. She couldn't throw it away, not yet, but it didn't belong on display either. That evening, she found herself in the living room as Nathaniel entered the house. He was punctual, as always, briefcase in one hand, jacket folded neatly over his arm. He stopped when he saw her standing by the fireplace. "I assume the flowers arrived," he said, voice as composed as the suit he wore. "They did," she replied, her tone even. "Thank you." A pause settled between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. "Was there a reason you wanted me at the gala?" she asked finally, cutting through the politeness. He met her eyes, gray on green. "You're my wife." Her jaw tightened. "That hasn't seemed to matter much before." Nathaniel blinked, once, but didn't flinch. "It matters now." "That's not an answer," she said softly, her voice threading through the silence like violin strings just before breaking. He said nothing, and Eleanor, after waiting so long to be heard, turned away. The next week brought small, strange shifts. Nathaniel began coming home earlier. Once. She found him reading in the study instead of retreating into his office. Another night, he asked awkwardly, almost shyly, if she wanted to take dinner in the garden instead of the dining room. They spoke more, but the words were surface level. Safe. Still, it was more than silence. It was almost enough to stir a forgotten hope, until the Sunday brunch. The invitation had come from the Kensingtons, a power couple Nathaniel did business with regularly. Brunches at their estate were a high society ritual, expensive, curated, and quietly competitive. Eleanor had only attended once before, early in their marriage, and had spent most of it pretending she didn't feel like a well-dressed mannequin. This time, she wore a pale blue dress, simple and dignified, and twisted her hair into a soft bun. When Nathaniel saw her, his eyes lingered. "You look elegant," he said. It wasn't much, but it was more than before. At the Kensingtons, the usual crowd had gathered polished women in pearls, men who smelled like old whiskey and new money. Eleanor floated beside Nathaniel, smiling on cue, nodding in conversations that orbited wealth, investments, and vacation homes like satellites. Then came Vanessa Hartwell, a fashion columnist with the kind of smile that always carried a knife. "My God," she exclaimed, her eyes locking on Eleanor. "You brought your wife." People were starting to think she was a myth. Eleanor froze for half a second, then gave a polite smile. "Nice to see you again." Vanessa leaned in, voice syrupy. "I just assumed you were one of those distant arrangement types. All business, no breakfast." Nathaniel's posture stiffened beside her. Eleanor let the comment land, then looked Vanessa square in the eye. "Well, some arrangements evolve. Yours, I assume, remains contractual." There was a beat of silence, then a soft ripple of laughter from someone nearby. Vanessa's smile faltered. Nathaniel's hand, still at Eleanor's back, tightened just slightly. On the drive home, the car was quiet, not cold, just full of static, like a radio between stations. Eleanor stared out the window, trees rushing past in shades of green and gold. "Do people always assume you married for optics?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel's hands flexed on the steering wheel. "People assume what they need to in order to feel superior." "That's a clever answer," she replied, "but not an honest one." He didn't speak for a while. Then, softly, "I married you because you were strong, capable, the only person in the room who never tried to impress me." Eleanor turned to him slowly. And yet, you spent 3 years pretending I wasn't there. The car rolled to a stop in the driveway. Nathaniel killed the engine. The silence inside the vehicle stretched taut between them. I didn't know how to let you in, he admitted, so I built a house around us and locked every door. Eleanor's throat tightened. And now, he looked at her, really looked. Now I'm terrified I've lost the only person who ever made that house feel like home. That night, she didn't sleep in his room. Not yet. But she stood in her doorway longer than usual, watching the hallway that separated them. The walls between them weren't gone, but they were. Thinner. And for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that even the strongest doors could, one day, be opened. The note came on a Tuesday morning, slipped discreetly through the front gate in a cream envelope with no return address. Eleanor found it tucked beneath the morning paper, handwritten in sharp, familiar penmanship. Coffee, I'd like to talk. A. Underneath, a place and time. The Old Mill Cafe. Wednesday. 10 a.m. She stared at the message for a long moment, heart ticking like a slow metronome. Michael Alden. She hadn't spoken to him since the gala. Their conversation on the balcony that night had been brief, but disarming. Honest in a way she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just that he had seen her. It was that he remembered who she was. Before the silence, before the compromise, before the locked doors. The Old Mill Cafe was nestled off a back road near the river, housed in what used to be a working grain mill. Rustic beams, old brick, and the smell of roasted coffee beans made the space feel like a heartbeat with a roof. Eleanor arrived early. She wore simple linen slacks and a soft gray cardigan, nothing dramatic, but something that made her feel like herself again. Not a trophy, not an obligation, just a woman who used to laugh without apology. Michael arrived 2 minutes after 10, carrying that same quiet presence she remembered from years ago. He smiled when he saw her. You haven't changed. Eleanor raised a brow. You've started with a lie. He chuckled. All right, you've changed, but not in the ways that matter. They ordered 2 coffees and sat near the window, the river outside dancing with early fall sunlight. For the first few minutes, they talked about safe things, the town, people they both vaguely knew, the strange way time collapses when you're not paying attention. But slowly, the conversation deepened like water finding the cracks in dry earth. Michael stirred his coffee, then looked up. I was surprised to see you at the gala, not because you were there, but because you weren't introduced as someone's strategic partner. You looked like a ghost in someone else's story. Eleanor's breath caught. That's exactly how it feels, she said. Like I wandered into a script I didn't write, and no one gave me any lines. He tilted his head, studying her gently. What happened to the woman who used to argue about wage disparity with full fire in her voice? She got tired of fighting, Eleanor said softly, and she thought she was doing the right thing for her family, for the future. Michael nodded, understanding blooming in his eyes. Sacrifice. We dress it up like nobility, but sometimes it's just quiet surrender. They sat in silence for a moment. Then he leaned forward. I'm building something out west. Real work. Community-based investment projects, sustainable economics, educational access. But I need someone with your brain and your heart. Come with me. Help me build something good. Eleanor looked away, her throat tightening. This isn't charity, he added. You'd be my equal partner, fully autonomous, paid well, respected. The words hit harder than he knew. Respected. It had been so long since she'd heard the word and believed it could belong to her again. But behind that flicker of excitement was guilt, a whisper of betrayal toward the man waiting in their quiet estate, trying clumsily to bridge the distance he had helped create. Michael must have sensed it. I'm not trying to come between anything, he said gently. I'm just offering a door. What you walk through, that's up to you. That night, Eleanor didn't speak of the meeting. Nathaniel was home early again, trying with small gestures to close a canyon 3 years wide. He'd asked her to review some charitable partnership proposals with him over dinner. It was the first time he'd invited her input on anything related to his work. Over the flicker of candlelight, he watched her carefully. His voice was softer, but there was a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there before. "Was your day full?" he asked. She nodded. "Eventful." "You saw someone," Eleanor met his eyes, calm and clear. "Yes, Michael Alden." A pause. Nathaniel's fingers stilled around his wine glass. He said nothing for a moment, then set the glass down. "And he offered me a job, a partnership, really, out west, something meaningful." Nathaniel leaned back, expression unreadable. "Are you considering it? I'm considering myself," she said quietly. They sat in silence after that, and Eleanor could feel it the wall between them, still standing but thinner now, almost fragile. Then, almost too quietly to hear, Nathaniel asked, "Would it matter?" "If I said I didn't want you to go," Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "I don't want to be needed out of fear," she said. "I want to be chosen." He didn't reply, but the way his shoulders sank ever so slightly told her everything. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of emotion, desire for purpose, hunger for recognition, ache for the man across the hall who had finally, just maybe, begun to feel. But was it too late? Could a marriage survive if it started with duty? And only later discovered longing. And if she did leave, what would she be choosing? Freedom, or the fear of being forgotten all over again? Outside her window, the wind stirred the roses in the garden. She closed her eyes and whispered into the dark, "See me, just once, fully, or I will go." Eleanor woke to the sound of music, not loud or intrusive, just a faint melody drifting up through the floorboards, like someone had forgotten to turn the radio off. She blinked into the morning light, momentarily disoriented. The house was never this alive before 7. She glanced at the clock, 6:14 a.m., too early for surprises, especially here. Pulling on a robe, she padded barefoot down the hallway, her silk nightgown whispering against the wood as she descended the staircase. The scent hit her first warm butter, coffee, and something vaguely citrus. When she turned the corner into the kitchen, she stopped cold. Nathaniel was standing at the stove, in sweatpants and a white t-shirt, holding a spatula. He turned at the sound of her breath catching and offered a half smile, nervous, uncertain, almost boyish. The kind of expression you wear when you're walking on a frozen lake and you're not sure if it'll hold. "Good morning," he said, voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Eleanor blinked, still trying to place the scene. "Am I dreaming? I don't think so," he said, flipping what looked like a pancake with focused precision. "Though I did burn the first one, so maybe it's a little surreal either way." The table was set. Plates, forks, fresh orange juice, and coffee that smelled better than anything their machine had ever produced. There were even cloth napkins, the real ones. She hesitated at the threshold. "You cook, I do a lot of things," Nathaniel said, carefully sliding a pancake onto one of the plates, most of them badly, but I figured this was a place to start. She didn't sit. Not yet. "What is this?" she asked gently, not accusing, just unsure. He turned off the burner, set the spatula down, and faced her fully. His expression was open in a way that made her heart clench. "This is me trying," he said, "to cook, to apologize." Eleanor stared at him, at the man who had spent 3 years behind doors, behind formality, behind cold routine, and who now stood in her kitchen with flour on his sleeve and something dangerously close to vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, "but I know I've been distant, absent. And it's not because you weren't worth showing up for. It's because I didn't know how to be seen." She swallowed. And now, he looked at her, a little closer this time. "Now I'm terrified that someone else saw you before I did." The room went still. "I didn't kiss Michael," she said. "I didn't ask. You didn't have to." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "He offered you a way out." Eleanor finally moved to the table, her hand resting on the back of a chair. He offered me a way forward. Nathaniel nodded slowly, his throat moving as he swallowed something hard. Then, after a beat, he pulled out the chair for her. "Will you sit?" he asked, not commanding asking. It might have been the first time in years he'd truly asked her for anything. She did. The pancakes were a little uneven, one side darker than the other, the butter slightly overmelted. The juice was freshly squeezed but had pulp, which she usually hated. But when she took the first bite, her eyes welled without warning. He watched her carefully. "Bad." She shook her head. "It's something I didn't know I needed." They ate mostly in silence. Not awkward new, like two people sharing a first date after years of pretending they were just polite roommates. Halfway through her coffee, Eleanor said softly, "This doesn't erase everything. I know. I'm still angry." "You should be." She looked at him then. "So why now?" Nathaniel's eyes flickered to the window, where the morning sun had just reached the roses she tended every day. "Because when he touched your arm at the gala, I felt like a man watching someone else open a door I never had the courage to knock on." He turned back to her, voice rough. "And because you looked happy when you said his name. Not in love, not swept away, just alive. I hadn't seen that in you for years. And I realized, God help me, I was the one who'd taken it." Her breath caught again. Then, with quiet steadiness, she said, "I want more than pancakes, Nathaniel." He nodded, slowly. "So do I." Later that day, she found a note taped inside her study. "Tell me what matters to you. I want to learn." And it was the first time he'd asked for her thoughts, not her presence, not her appearance, her mind. And Eleanor, unsure of everything else, knew one thing: that morning wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a first step. And sometimes, the smallest door left open is enough for hope to slip back in. The email arrived just before noon the next day. It was brief, professional, signed with kindness, but it changed everything. Subject: project proposal, lead position confidential, from Michael Alden to Eleanor Royce. "Eleanor, as discussed, I'd be honored to have you join our initiative in Colorado. The role is yours if you want it: lead strategist, full autonomy, with a team that values vision over title. We begin initial site visits next month. If you're willing, I'd love to have you at the table where real change begins. Warmly, Michael." Eleanor read it twice, then a third time. Her chest was quiet, but not calm. There was no pressure in his tone, no demand, only a door wide open, and she could walk through it. She stood by the window in her study, the same window she had sat beside 100 mornings, wondering if her life would ever shift. Now it had. But the ground beneath her felt less like liberation and more like the edge of something deeply uncertain. When Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, she didn't turn. She didn't need to. She felt him, his presence still wrapped in silence, but not the cold kind. Now it was watchful, waiting. "I heard from Michael," she said softly. A pause. "What did he say?" "He offered me the position." She turned then, meeting his eyes. "Lead strategist. Total freedom. Full respect." Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but something inside him visibly tightened. "And what do you want to say back?" Eleanor hesitated. "I don't know yet." That night, Nathaniel opened a bottle of wine, not the expensive one he used for investors, the one she used to love from a vineyard they'd visited just once, years ago, before everything became a ledger. He poured her a glass, then stood at the edge of the kitchen island, unsure if he should stay or retreat. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat. For a long time, they said nothing. The wine sat between them like a truth serum. Then she spoke. "You know, I used to think silence was the worst thing someone could offer." Nathaniel's gaze lifted, but it's not. She continued. "Indifference is worse, because silence, at least, can be broken. But indifference..." Her voice trailed off. He didn't argue. "I was never indifferent," he said finally, "just afraid." "Of what?" of needing you more than you needed me. Eleanor exhaled, slow and heavy. You already did. You just didn't know how to say it. The next morning, Nathaniel was gone early, as usual, but on the kitchen counter sat a manila envelope, her name written in his handwriting across the front. Inside were documents. Royce Foundation proposal for joint leadership attached was a formal offer not from Michael, but from Nathaniel, a restructure of his own company, creating a sister organization focused on economic impact projects. Her name at the top as co-director. He had signed it. No obligation, no pretense. At the bottom, a note. Whatever you choose, I'll respect it, but I'd rather build something with you than alone. N. Eleanor stood at the island for a long time, the weight of both offers pressing into her bones. Two men, two directions, both offering more than just work. Michael offered space, vision, freedom. Nathaniel offered presence, humility, a long overdue invitation to be a partner, not just a placeholder. But love, true love, was never just about choosing someone. It was about choosing with someone. And Eleanor, for the first time, needed to choose herself first. That evening, she called Michael. He picked up after the first ring, voice warm. Eleanor, I got your email. I meant every word. I know. She hesitated, and I'm honored, truly. But she took a breath, the kind that steadied something fragile. But I think my place is here, not because it's easier, but because there's still something worth building. A pause. Then Michael chuckled softly. Not bitter, not surprised. It was never really about me. Was it? It could have been, she said gently. If I hadn't already started finding myself again right where I almost lost her. I'm glad, he replied. More than you know. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Whatever you build, make sure it's yours too, not just his. She smiled. It will be. Later that night, Eleanor walked into Nathaniel's study for the first time in 3 years. He was reading, or at least pretending to. When he saw her, he stood immediately, almost startled. I spoke to Michael, she said. He nodded once, his face unreadable. I turned down the offer, she continued. I want to try this, your proposal. Our proposal. Relief flickered across his features, but he didn't move. Not because I'm staying in the past, she added, but because I believe we might finally be building a future. Nathaniel stepped forward. His hand reached for hers, hesitant but open. She took it, and it felt right, like something had healed, not fully, but enough to begin again. The days that followed moved slowly, like the pause between a breath in and a breath out. Eleanor found herself waking before the alarm, not from anxiety, but something quieter, restlessness, maybe, or anticipation. There was something strange about standing on the edge of your own becoming. Every corner of the Royce estate seemed different now. The kitchen held the ghost of laughter. The study smelled of paper and purpose. Even the garden, her long-held sanctuary, now felt like a room with windows opened for the first time. And Nathaniel. He had changed, not all at once, not dramatically, but in those small, deeply human ways that mattered. He asked questions now, not just out of formality, but curiosity. He listened without correcting. He waited without controlling. And still, Eleanor hesitated, because healing wasn't just about someone reaching for you. It was about who you became while you waited to be seen. One afternoon, Eleanor returned home to find a box on her writing desk, unmarked, simple. Inside was an old leather-bound journal, her own, long forgotten, one she had kept in the early years of their marriage and abandoned when the silence got too loud. Nathaniel had found it in storage. She opened it, pages yellowed but still legible, filled with the woman she used to be. Her words were full of questions, raw hope, and loneliness wrapped in intellectual armor. I don't want to be a painting hung in someone's hallway. I want to be the sun coming through the window, felt, not just observed. She closed the book slowly, hands trembling. That version of herself had never truly left. She had just dimmed. And now, she wasn't sure which light to walk toward. That night, Eleanor stood by the fireplace, watching flames dance behind the screen. Nathaniel entered the room, holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He offered her one. "Thank you," she said, accepting it. They sat across from each other, the silence between them no longer hollow, but heavy with meaning. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. He looked at her, patient, about what it means to stay, to build something together. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "And it means we'll both have to let go of who we were," she said. "Not just the silence, not just the habits, but the idea that we're safer apart than we are honest together." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm willing to do that, every day, if I have to." She studied him. The man who once wore control like armor now looked like someone learning how to take off a mask he'd forgotten was even there. "I need time," she whispered. His eyes didn't harden. They softened. "I can give you time," he said. "Just don't shut the door completely." So Eleanor left. Not forever, not out of anger, but out of need. She spent 1 week in Colorado, not with Michael, but alone. She visited the project site he had spoken of, met the local teams, walked the land. She gave a spontaneous guest lecture at a community college nearby, and the students asked questions that lit her up from the inside. She stayed in a small inn with creaky stairs and a porch swing that overlooked pine trees and stars. She wrote, she read. She remembered what her voice sounded like when no one was watching, and when Michael invited her to dinner on her last night there, she accepted gratefully, platonically. They sat by a wood-fire grill, shared a bottle of red wine, and talked not about what could have been, but what was. "I knew you wouldn't stay," Michael said with a kind smile. "You offered me something I needed," Eleanor replied. "A way out, a way to look inward." He raised his glass. Then it was worth it. When she returned to New Hampshire, the leaves had begun to fall. She stepped into the Royce estate with a lighter step, a deeper breath, the same house. Yes, but not the same woman. Nathaniel met her at the door. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand answers. Instead, he simply said, "Welcome home." And this time, it felt true, not because the house had changed, but because she had. That evening, Eleanor unpacked slowly. She placed the leather-bound journal back on her shelf next to a brand new one, blank, waiting. She sat by the garden window with a pen in her hand and wrote just one sentence. "I didn't choose between 2 lives. I chose the woman I wanted to become, and from that place, everything else began." The days that followed moved slowly, like the pause between a breath in and a breath out. Eleanor found herself waking before the alarm, not from anxiety, but something quieter. Restlessness, maybe, or anticipation. There was something strange about standing on the edge of your own becoming. Every corner of the Royce estate seemed different now. The kitchen held the ghost of laughter. The study smelled of paper and purpose. Even the garden, her long-held sanctuary, now felt like a room with windows open for the first time. And Nathaniel. He had changed, not all at once, not dramatically, but in those small, deeply human ways that mattered. He asked questions now, not just out of formality, but curiosity. He listened without correcting. He waited without controlling. And still, Eleanor hesitated. Because healing wasn't just about someone reaching for you. It was about who you became while you waited to be seen. One afternoon, Eleanor returned home to find a box on her writing desk, unmarked, simple. Inside was an old leather-bound journal, her own, long forgotten, one she had kept in the early years of their marriage and abandoned when the silence got too loud. Nathaniel had found it in storage. She opened it, pages yellowed but still legible, filled with the woman she used to be. Her words were full of questions, raw hope, and loneliness wrapped in intellectual armor. "I don't want to be a painting hung in someone's hallway. I want to be the sun coming through the window." Felt, not just observed. She closed the book slowly, hands trembling. That version of herself had never truly left. She had just dimmed. And now, she wasn't sure which light to walk toward. That night, Eleanor stood by the fireplace, watching flames dance behind the screen. Nathaniel entered the room, holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He offered her one. "Thank you," she said, accepting it. They sat across from each other, the silence between them no longer hollow but heavy with meaning. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. He looked at her, patient, about what it means to stay, to build something together. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "And it means we'll both have to let go of who we were," she said. "Not just the silence, not just the habits, but the idea that we're safer apart than we are, honest together." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm willing to do that. Every day, if I have to." She studied him. The man who once wore control like armor now looked like someone learning how to take off a mask he'd forgotten was even there. "I need time," she whispered. His eyes didn't harden. They softened. "I can give you time," he said. "Just don't shut the door completely." So Eleanor left. Not forever. Not out of anger, but out of need. She spent 1 week in Colorado not with Michael, but alone. She visited the project site he had spoken of, met the local teams, walked the land. She gave a spontaneous guest lecture at a community college nearby, and the students asked questions that lit her up from the inside. She stayed in a small inn with creaky stairs and a porch swing that overlooked pine trees and stars. She wrote. She read. She remembered what her voice sounded like when no one was watching, and when Michael invited her to dinner on her last night there, she accepted gratefully, platonically. They sat by a wood-fire grill, shared a bottle of red wine, and talked not about what could have been, but what was. "I knew you wouldn't stay," Michael said with a kind smile. "You offered me something I needed." Eleanor replied, "A way out, a way to look inward." He raised his glass, then it was worth it. When she returned to New Hampshire, the leaves had begun to fall. She stepped into the Royce estate with a lighter step, a deeper breath. The same house, yes, but not the same woman. Nathaniel met her at the door. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand answers. Instead, he simply said, "Welcome home." And this time, it felt true. Not because the house had changed, but because she had. That evening, Eleanor unpacked slowly. She placed the leather-bound journal back on her shelf next to a brand new one, blank, waiting. She sat by the garden window with a pen in her hand and wrote just one sentence. "I didn't choose between 2 lives. I chose the woman I wanted to become." And from that place, everything else began. 6 months later, the Royce estate didn't look different from the outside. The white columns still stood tall. The fountain still whispered its soft rhythm. The roses still bloomed under Eleanor's careful hands. But inside, everything had changed. The silence had been replaced with music, soft jazz in the evenings, classical on Sunday mornings, the occasional hum of Eleanor singing to herself in the kitchen. The walls held color now, not just paint, but life. Books scattered on coffee tables, a half-finished puzzle on the sideboard, 2 mugs instead of 1 in the drying rack. They still had separate offices, still needed space, but the doors between them were open now, literally and otherwise. Eleanor stood at the head of the conference room in downtown Boston, wearing a dark green sheath dress and low heels, her presence calm but magnetic. She was presenting the first joint initiative of the Royce Impact Fund, a collaboration between Nathaniel's company and a growing nonprofit alliance for community-driven economic reform. Her voice was steady as she addressed the board. The future of sustainable growth isn't built in boardrooms alone. It's rooted in listening to stories, to needs, to human dignity. We're not here to save. We're here to empower. As she finished, a room full of suits and skeptical expressions broke into quiet applause. And at the far end of the table, Nathaniel watched her not with pride alone, but with awe. Afterward, as the room cleared, he walked to her slowly, his movements deliberate, like every step mattered. "You were brilliant," he said, eyes warm. Eleanor smiled, teasing, not just appropriate. He gave a short laugh. You've never been anything less than extraordinary. I just didn't have the language to say it before. She tilted her head. And now, he said, taking her hand. I'm fluent. That evening, they cooked dinner together. Nothing fancy grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, a glass of Oregon Pinot. The kitchen buzzed with quiet conversation, shared tasks, and that easy intimacy that doesn't demand constant expression. It just is. After the meal, they sat on the back porch, watching dusk settle over the garden. Nathaniel broke the silence. Do you ever regret it? She looked at him. Staying, he nodded, eyes searching hers. Eleanor leaned back against the cushion, thoughtful. No, because I didn't stay for the same reason I married you. I stayed for the woman I became in spite of it all. He swallowed hard. You've given me more grace than I ever deserved. She turned to him. You didn't need to deserve it. You needed to choose it. And you did. Nathaniel took a breath, as if preparing to leap. I've been thinking about something, he said. Something you wrote in that old journal. She raised an eyebrow. I don't want to be a painting hung in someone's hallway. I want to be the sun coming through the window. He smiled softly. You've been the sun, Eleanor, even when I kept the curtains closed. Her eyes filled not with sadness, but with the full weight of being seen. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for his hand, and in that simple touch, there was everything: forgiveness, history, hope. 2 weeks later, a package arrived at the Royce estate, from Colorado. Inside was a framed photo of Eleanor standing in front of the college campus she'd visited months earlier, laughing with students after her impromptu lecture. Alongside it, a handwritten note from Michael. You chose the harder road, and made it yours. Keep walking. Eleanor, the world needs more of your light. She smiled, tears prickling the corners of her eyes. Nathaniel entered the room just as she finished reading. He glanced at the frame, then at her. You okay? She nodded. More than okay. He walked behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. You made the right choice. She looked at him in the mirror. No. We made the right choice. That night, in their shared bedroom. Yes, shared now. Though it had taken time, they lay tangled in warm sheets and quiet breaths. Eleanor rested her head on his chest, his fingers idly tracing the lines of her collarbone. I used to think love was the spark, she whispered. The fire, the heat, the drama. And now I know it's the warmth that stays after the fire has burned. The thing you build from ashes, not from fireworks. Nathaniel pressed a kiss to her forehead. I want to keep building, he murmured, with you. Always. Eleanor smiled, her voice a soft promise in the dark. Then let's never lock another door between us. Outside. The wind shifted, and somewhere deep within that house once built for appearances, a real home finally breathed. Sometimes, the deepest kind of loneliness isn't found in solitude, it's found in a life shared without being truly seen. Eleanor's story reminds us that love without presence becomes absence, and presence without connection becomes silence. In a world where so many relationships are built on duty, appearances, or fear of starting over, this story gently challenges us to ask, am I living beside someone, or with them? For older audiences, those who've lived through marriages, compromises, and years of quiet endurance, this tale resonates deeply. It's not just about romance. It's about reclaiming voice, worth, and emotional honesty, no matter your age. It teaches us that it's never too late to reopen a closed door, not just to someone else, but to yourself. You can still choose change. You can still choose to be heard. And sometimes, healing begins not in leaving, but in staying with courage, demanding more, and offering more in return. The heart doesn't expire. It waits for a chance to be seen and chosen again, and perhaps, this time, chosen rightly. Let this story be your quiet nudge toward connection with those you love, and with the self you may have set aside long ago. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. If it touched your heart or reminded you of something real in your own life, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to Shining Stories. Your support helps us continue bringing heartfelt, meaningful stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, take care and never stop choosing what truly matters.